Go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy to get 20% off your first month of cognitive behavioural therapy, with weekly sessions online with a therapist, in addition to worksheets, a journal, meditation and yoga videos, and unlimited messaging. There's strong evidence that CBT can help people who hoard, and accessing therapy online can be affordable and accessible. Find out more and get your discount at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy.
Here's a cool fact. A crocodile can't stick out its tongue. Another cool fact, you can get short-term health insurance for a month or just under a year in some states. United Healthcare short-term insurance plans are designed for people who are between jobs, coming off their parents' plan, or turning a side hustle into a full-time gig. Underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, they offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage with access to a nationwide network of doctors and hospitals. Get more cool facts about United Healthcare short-term plans at uh1.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Think of all the sleep hacks you've ever heard. You could spend years trying them all, or you could instantly transform your sleep with Boll & Branch. They make the softest, most breathable bedding you'll ever feel. And it's all 20% off. That's their best sale of the entire season. Millions of sleepers love their buttery soft sheets, airy blankets, cloud-like duvets, and so much more. And you can try all of them for 20% off with promo code BUTTERY20. So hurry to bollandbranch.com today. That's BOLL and branch.com. See site for details.
Welcome to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder podcast. I am drowning in stuff and trying to find a way out. Listen as I explore the issues and delve deep as somebody profoundly affected by hoarding disorder. Find out more, including links to subscribe to the podcast at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk, and find the links there to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and all over the place. So I've had a review that I want to read out because it is just lovely, and it was left on Apple USA by somebody called An Uncluttered Space. And it says, "Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your journey with us. Your vulnerability is making a difference. It has helped me to gain so much understanding of people who suffer from your disorder and the need to be patient. Although I don't suffer from the same disorder, a lot of your tips are very helpful to me personally and in my line of work. I actually launched a biz as a professional organiser in the last year. Note, I don't work with people with hoarding disorder at this point because I don't have the training. Organising is something I have always been good at. Even as a toddler, I loved sorting my grandpa's glass jars of nuts and bolts, etc. But I also think part of how I cope with trauma, emotional neglect, uncertainty in my childhood was to organise. I am not OCD about it. My home looks neat but lived in. But clutter creates anxiety in me and is depressing. Order creates a sense of peace and safety for me. In a way, it almost feels like the flip side of the coin of hoarding. Well, that's my story. Thanks again. I hope you'll continue with your podcast and that you'll continue making progress in your personal journey to freedom." And that was a 5-star review. And thank you so much. Thank you. I find it really interesting to think of who's listening to this, because what I imagine is that it's a mixture of probably mainly people who hoard, also some people who love people who hoard. Maybe you're married to somebody who hoards, or your parent or your sister or your friend is a hoarder. But yes, I've I suspect also that there are professionals, whether that's therapists or professional organisers or social workers or child protection services, anything like that, may be listening as well to get insights. And so I kind of doubly appreciate people in that camp listening, because it shows that you want to get the perspective of a hoarder rather than just listen to experts, in inverted commas, I guess, who have no experience of it. There is a lot to be said for people who study and become experts professionally, but I think if you're not listening to the people directly affected by this condition, you're just missing something in your professional training or your professional perspective. And so, first of all, I really appreciate that you listen as a professional organiser. Secondly, I'm sorry you've had trauma and neglect and uncertainty. That's really rough. But thirdly, it is interesting what you say, that kind of for you, peace and safety is order and disorder is anxiety. Whereas for a lot of those of us who hoard, order is quite anxiety provoking, whereas chaos and clutter is somehow reassuring. So thank you. I really appreciate you having got in touch. So today I am going to do, as promised, a Q&A episode. You have been sending me your questions and I am going to answer them. There are some really interesting ones and I hope I do them justice. Before I start, I'm going to say that if you sent me the question publicly, like as a Twitter reply, I will use your name. If you sent it me privately, like a DM or an email, I will not use your name. So there's no need to worry about that. So I may as well just get started. So the first question came privately, so I will not name the person who sent it. And they said, from your experience, is the syndrome triggered by a sudden trauma in adulthood? I understand that the syndrome stems from complex childhood trauma, but do you think it will stay dormant if nothing dramatic triggers it later in life? Really interesting question. And I should say at this point that I am somebody who hoards rather than a clinical psychologist or a trained therapist, but I will answer it from my perspective and from what I know from other people as well. So, in my experience, there was trauma in adulthood that sparked the worst of it. There had been messy childhood stuff, combined with me being a very messy person. I was always in trouble as a child for not tidying up, and it wasn't that I didn't want to, it was that I never quite understood how. My dad in particular would try and teach me, and he'd say, okay, that drawer is for this kind of toy, and that drawer is for this kind of toy. Which one should this go in? And I just wouldn't be able to answer the question. I couldn't. My brain, it was like that bit of my brain was missing. Couldn't do it. And being very messy continued into adulthood. I left home at 18, was still messy in my new homes. So that was how I already was. But for me, the trauma that triggered that messiness to turn into full-on hoarding wasn't sudden as such. It was an extended period of poverty. I had no income for 6 months, and then for the 6 months after that, I had a tiny bit of income. And so I was in a place where I was having to choose between buying soap or buying shampoo. That kind of thing. I had minimal amounts to eat. It was all pretty awful. And I was in a position where if I threw something away and later needed it, I had absolutely no way to replace it. No way at all. Nor any prospect of being able to replace it in the future. You know, sometimes if you're working, say the last week in the month while you're waiting to get paid, you might be a bit broke, but you know that as soon as that money goes into your bank, you're okay. When you're in extended poverty, you don't have that knowledge that it's coming, so you can't rely on anything coming in the future. So things were pretty dire, and I went from being a very messy person to being a person who kept every little thing, everything. And the significance of things got bigger in my mind. The value of the smallest thing increased. You know, the less you have of something, the more you value it. And I had little, and so I kept it all, and I kept the bits that most people wouldn't keep, because it took on a significance it hadn't had before. So for me, the stars aligned. Complex childhood trauma, plus a tendency to be messy, plus the extended trauma that tripped the switch into hoarding disorder. Now the question is, would I have developed it anyway? And there is no way of knowing. I do not know. From what I've seen and heard from others, there are lots of similar stories. I'm sure there are examples where there was complex childhood trauma and nothing in particular in adulthood where people developed hoarding disorder anyway. I'm sure that does happen. But a lot of the time, when somebody starts to hoard compulsively, I see stories where it's been triggered by something significant, some form of trauma, like a bereavement of somebody very close to you, or poverty, or any other kind of trauma. Can be, loss of a job, can be enough if you already have that groundwork in your psychological makeup that makes you prone to it. So I guess to answer your question, I would say hoarding behaviours aren't always necessarily prompted by a sudden trauma in adulthood, but I would also say that it's very common for that to be the case. Now, the next question is another anonymous one. And that person asked, would you describe compulsive hoarding as a dark side of creativity? Now, I think that's a really interesting question, and I've thought a lot about it, and my initial response is that certainly it could be. Again, I don't think it is every time. But for some people, and I'd probably include myself in this, there are elements of a kind of corrupted or toxic creativity that could play a part in things. On a kind of obvious level, those of us with lots of craft supplies, whether you're into knitting or card making or scrapbooking or whatever, that's a creative side of you that turns dark when you have 3 rooms full of unopened boxes of craft supplies. But also, I would take the question further into the way that people who hoard think. We see so much potential in things that others do not. Most people see an empty crisp packet that should go in the bin. A hoarder will see something they can melt down and sew into a shopping bag. So you're not throwing away trash. You're throwing away a potential creative project that would be good for the environment and look super cool and unique. Similarly, most people would see a year's old receipt for a notebook that you bought in 2007. A hoarder will see that receipt and remember what the notebook looked like, who they bought it for, what they felt like that day, where they were, how giving that gift made them feel, and what the recipient of the gift meant to them. And probably more that I can't think of offhand. So you're not just throwing away an old receipt, you're throwing away that whole memory. So if you think about it, when everything that looks like a piece of crap to most people looks like precious memories or potential creativity or something with an unrecognized purpose to you, that goes some way to explaining, I think, why stuff is more than stuff and why our thinking as hoarders is so skewed. And I do think, to answer your question, that I don't even want to call it an ability because that suggests it's a positive, but that ability to see endless potential in anything is a form of creativity, but it's not a helpful one. It's not a positive one. And you could argue that it is a dark side of creativity. My next question came from the lovely people at the Children of Hoarders Twitter account. I will link to them in the show notes. You must follow them if you don't already. They asked, when, how, why did you realise hoarding behaviours were a problem? So many families face denial, lack of insight, mountains of rationalisations, creating barriers bigger than any pile, destroying all shared reality and common ground. And I would say that my realisation that it was a problem was a gradual process that went through various flavours of denial over time and eventually came to a point where I fully recognise that how I live is not okay and that this is disordered thinking and disordered behaviour. So I always knew I was messy. I'd always been told I was messy because I was really messy. And I'd always struggled to understand how to organise, how to tidy, how to put away. And as a child, I thought, well, children are messy. And then as an adult, I thought, oh, it's not that bad. And then it got notably worse. It got to a point where things were getting unruly. But I still I absolutely believed at that point that my problem was one of failing to organise my stuff properly rather than having far too much stuff. And I remember an ex at the time in my house saying, you do realise you're going to have to get rid of at least 50% of your stuff, don't you? And I thought, don't be ridiculous. If I just get the right shelves and if I can just put things in the right place, it will be fine. It's a problem of organising, categorising, putting away and shelving, not a problem of volume of stuff. And that was what I believed for a fairly long time. And then as my house got more and more full and I stopped inviting people round, I would wonder if I had a problem, but dismiss that thought a lot. Because it was easier. It's far easier to say it's not a problem than to face the fact that you've got a great big problem. So I would push away any suspicions I had. And I guess the real true realisation that this was a bigger problem was when my home became less and less usable as a home, when there were rooms that I could just not use, when I was having to climb over things regularly, like not to get to that rare cupboard at the far end of the spare room, but just to get around the house. It's harder and harder to stay in denial. I found it was. And as I would do half-hearted attempts to sort it out, the other clue that I had a problem was the evidence when I tried to discard things, the evidence that my brain threw at me that I had strange attachments to things that most people wouldn't have. So I would say it was twofold. One was as the house became less usable, it became harder to deny that this was a problem. The other was that as I tried to do tiny bits of sorting and throwing and whatever, I realised just how hard I was finding it. And those two things combined to make me face up to the fact that this wasn't just that I was bad at housekeeping. This wasn't just that I hadn't organised my stuff properly. I'd read so many books over the years and tried so many schools of practice, like Fly Lady and all this stuff. And the harder it was to implement them, the more I had to face up to the reality. So for me, that was how and why I realised hoarding behaviours were a problem. I'm in a position where I do not have children, and I'm in a position where I don't live with a partner. I think if I had, well, maybe not so much if I had children, but if I had a partner I lived with, I think I may have been forced to see it earlier because I would have had the outside perspective, but I can't be sure. Now, the reason I hesitated when I initially said, or if I had children, was I was going to say if I had children, they may have forced me to see it as a problem. But actually, that's wrong on two levels. One is that if children grow up in an environment, they may well not know it's a problem themselves because it's their norm. The other reason I hesitated was because a child's role in any home is to be a child and to be loved and cared for and entertained and made laugh and taught and fed and kept warm. A child's role in any home is not to fix their mum or their dad or their sister or whoever is causing the problem. So it may be different if I had children. Maybe I would be making speedier progress with the realisation of how it was damaging them. But I don't know for sure. And as for when that realisation was, it took place over quite a long period of time. But I would say I've known for sure that this was compulsive hoarding. This was hoarding disorder. This wasn't just that I was naturally messy for 3-4 years, something like that.
Normally, being a little extra might be a bit much, but not when it comes to healthcare. That's why United Healthcare's Health Protector Guard fixed indemnity insurance plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, supplement your primary plan so you manage out-of-pocket costs. Learn more at uh1.com.
Hey there, it's Michelle Norris. I'm host of a podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. When I travel, I'm usually looking for a way to find a taste of home when I'm not at home. And one of the things I love to do when I am at home is entertain. And Airbnb allows me to do that. When I was in California recently, I rented a house that had a great kitchen. And when we were sitting around the table, we were all thinking, we're in someone else's house. Someone could be in all of our homes as well. If you have a home, but you're not always at home, you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
The next question came in on Twitter from Fermented Food Freak, who asked, do you have anyone affected with the disorder in your family? Do you think there can be a genetic component to it? So the first part, do I have anyone in the family with it? No. I will say the house I grew up in was very neat, but if you opened a cupboard, the entire history of the world was contained in there. I grew up in a family that kept everything, but in a very neat way. So no, they weren't hoarders because the house was perfectly functional. There was no weirdness. They didn't keep trash, any of that. But it was a house where you didn't throw out used wrapping paper because it could be reused. You didn't throw out the used newspaper because it should go in the recycling. We were recycling decades before it was cool. So I suspect that played a part in my guilt at throwing anything away. I'm not saying this to blame my parents because, reducing waste is a good thing to do. But I guess it taught part of my brain that things should not be thrown away if at all possible. In terms of whether I think there's a genetic component to it, I would say, when I think it's fairly clear, we can say there's definitely, or there can definitely be an inherited component to it. In that if you have a parent who hoards, you are more likely to hoard or have some kind of related problem yourself. However, whether that's genetic or whether it's learnt behaviour or a response to trauma. I just don't know. Whether it's something that's passed on in your blood, or whether it's something you see around you for your whole childhood and continue into your own adulthood, I don't know which is the cause. But there can definitely be an inherited connection. It's just how that works, the mechanism of that I don't know. And my next question is from my favourite Australian counsellor, Dr. Jan Eppingstall, regular guest on this podcast. And she asked me, I'd like to know what made you embark on this project. What changed in your life? What was the impetus? So in my answer to the Children of Hoarders question, I said that I had eventually realised I had a problem. But realising, so say about 3 or 4 years ago, but realising I had a problem did not mean I started to then take action. Because, and this has been a theme throughout the podcast, because I had no idea how to resolve this. And I was so overwhelmed by what I saw around me, and with no guidance and no impetus to change, that I was in a position where I recognised I had a problem, but I had no clue what to do about it. And so I just kind of lived with the problem. I knew it was there. I didn't know what to do. So I carried on stepping over things. I carried on sharing my bed with piles of magazines or whatever. I carried on having a bit of the sofa I could sit on. I was living almost alongside my hoarding disorder with I was going to say with no attempts to tackle it, and that's not true. I would try periodically to tackle it, but I had no idea what I was doing. I had no support because, another theme of the podcast, the shame is so great that it's not something I'm publicly open about. And every bit of advice I read seemed like a drop in the ocean compared to what I needed to do. And so I would periodically try and have a blitz and fail, and that would reinforce in my brain this idea that I couldn't possibly fix this problem. I was just stuck with it forever. And then a year and a bit ago was when I got found out by my landlord, which is a story in itself. But basically, I was in a position where not only did somebody know, but the worst possible person from my point of view knew. And in order to minimise the trouble I was in, I had to agree to make change and to undergo CBT. So while this was an absolutely terrifying and horrifying and humiliating thing to go through, it also pushed me into a place where I had to act and I had to get some support. I had to keep my tenancy. And so I started having CBT. I've done a whole episode on my experience of CBT for hoarding disorder, and I talked about it a bit on the episode I did with Jan about different types of therapy for hoarding disorder. But my experience of CBT was that I had an initial 6 weeks that were pretty useless, and then I was referred on to a more in-depth form of CBT where I had 20 weeks of support, and that was pretty useful indeed, and armed me with a lot of little tips and tricks and techniques and mental exercises to stop me giving up and to make me try things and to make little bits of progress. And so a combination of the housing officer would need to see an improvement next time she came, along with finally having some dedicated support for this problem. I'd had mental health support before, but not about hoarding, more about more general mental health stuff. So that was just over a year ago, and that was when I started to finally make progress. That was when the Dehoarding project began in earnest. And also the podcast, which I didn't know if anybody would listen, but it was a way to keep myself accountable. And you are listening, and you're massively supportive, and it's so helpful. It's so helpful. So what changed in my life was external circumstances pushed me to have to take some action. That was the impetus, but I had been aware of the problem for some time. I just felt powerless in the face of it. And the final question is another anonymous one. And that person asked, what's working for you at the moment and what's still an obstacle? And one thing that's working for me is I'm looking at what's working for me already and trying to extend it just a tiny, tiny bit. Now, this relates a bit to the idea that Dr. Jan mentioned in our episode on procrastination, which came from James Clear. And that was the idea about starting to do something for just 2 minutes. Like, you want to end up going running every day, and at the start of trying to make this happen, all you have to do is put your trainers on for 2 minutes and then take them off. And I've been doing a version of that, but not with timing. So something that's quite bad, that's quite difficult, is that even when I'm doing quite well at sorting and throwing things, putting things in rubbish bags, I'm still quite bad at getting them out of the house. So I put them behind the front door, rubbish bags, thinking that when I next go out, I will take them with me to the outside bin. The reality is that I often don't do that, and so rubbish bags build up behind the front door and through the hallway. And then I don't take rubbish bags out because it's difficult to get down the hallway with them. So it's a real vicious cycle. I would say 90% of hoarding problems are born in vicious cycles. But I've been trying this for the last few weeks and it seems to be working. And that is, my extending the task a tiny, tiny bit is that when I have a bag full of rubbish, then instead of putting it behind the front door, I put it outside the front door. And that's a pretty easy difference. Instead of putting it there, I open the door and put it somewhere 1 foot away. And it's hard to argue against that as logic. If you can be bothered to put it in one place, it doesn't take much more effort to put it somewhere slightly further out. But the reality is that once I have the front door open and the bag of rubbish in my hand, I nearly always think, well, I'm pretty much outside now. I may as well just put it in the big bin. And it's important for me that I don't, when I'm inside with the rubbish bag in my hand, I don't think, okay, go put it in the big bin. Otherwise, I will come up with reasons not to. Whereas if the only thing I have to do is open the door and put it outside instead of putting it behind the door on the inside, then that's an easy addition. It just so happens that when I do that, it nearly always transforms into even better action. So that is an example of the kind of thinking tricks that I'm using that I'm having reasonable success with. What is still an obstacle? I would say the speed of progress. I'm making progress, but if I had known how slow it would be and how hard it would be, I don't know if I would have embarked on it as enthusiastically when I had the opportunity about a year and a bit ago. I'm impatient. I'm an impatient person at the best of times, and I want to see results, and I'm seeing results, but there is so much to do. And while I do my best CBT on my regular feelings of overwhelm, it is hard to keep that at bay. So I would say the obstacle is just the scale of the task. That's my biggest obstacle. And the only way, of course, to reduce that obstacle is to keep on keeping on. So thank you for sending me questions. I love that. It's good to know what people want to know and to make sure I answer that for you. So thank you to everybody who sent those in. In just 1 second, I'll give you my top tip of the week. In the meantime, please do subscribe to the podcast, review it, 5 stars would be amazing, and share it with your friends or anyone who might be interested or who might benefit from it. It all really helps. To find more ways to support the website, the podcast, and my overall dehoarding project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Now, back to your top tip. So my top tip this week is a tweet from Denise Lee at Clear Spaces LLC. I will link to her Twitter in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. And her tweet says, "It's a choice. Put off that project you've been avoiding longer, or spend 10 minutes assessing it and identifying some steps that you can take on it. Both choices have consequences. Which choice will help you in the long run?" So that's a good question to ask yourself if you're avoiding something. So thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. You can find more online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at @thathoarder and on Facebook at Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to this podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes.
Confidence starts with loving who you are. And when your skin feels nourished and glows on the outside, you naturally radiate confidence from the inside. Give your skin a glow up with Osea's clinically proven Mega Moisture Duo. This ultra-hydrating body care features 2 of Osea's best sellers, Undaria Algae Body Oil and Undaria Collagen Body Lotion. These seaweed-powered heroes use skincare-level ingredients normally reserved for your face for results you can see and confidence you can feel. Osea has been making clean, clinically proven seaweed-infused face and body care products for over 28 years. This luxurious skincare is vegan, cruelty-free, and climate-neutral certified, so you never have to choose between your values and your best skin. Glow from the inside out. Get 10% off your first order with code GLOW at OseaMalibu.com. That's OSEAMalibu.com, code GLOW.